Hi and welcome to the NBA show. My name is Morten Jensen. Today we'll be discussing the Cleveland Cavaliers and where they should go next. Stay tuned. The Cleveland Cavaliers right now are 10 games under 500. That could have changed during the night. I'm recording this on Tuesday, March 16th, and they have a game tonight. Who knows? It could be worse, it could be a little bit better, but the point is it's not really looking that good for them this particular season. That, however, does not mean that all hope is lost. Yes, they're trying to get rid of Andre Drummond and they are finding no luck in doing so, but at the worst possible outcome, he's just an expiring contract, so getting him off the books after the conclusion of this season means that they'll have more money to spend or at least have more cap flexibility. From there, you look at the current roster and the guys that are trying to build around, and it's actually a pretty decent roster from the top of it. Colin Sexton and Darius Garland, both of whom are sharing the backcourt, are 38% shooters from range, shooting both over 80% from the line. Sexton is at almost 24 points a game and 4 assists. Garland at over 16 points and almost 6 assists per game as well. So both of them are contributing and they're super young. The future outlook just in terms of offensive production is pretty substantial. Now, yes, there are defensive concerns. Both of them are very small players, like physically, so there will be occasions where they will just get overwhelmed defensively. And that's in part why they drafted Isaac Okoro in last year's draft. He's been playing the small forward position and steadily so. He's been as advertised, a game-changing defender who still has a lot of work to do offensively. Now, in the James Harden trade that was conducted earlier this year, Cleveland was actually involved and they got Jared Allen out of it, a very young, established center who is really productive on the glass, high efficiency scorer, a guy who understands the value of shot selection. He should be their main center moving forward, especially considering they have no plans to retain Andre Drummond. That said, they still need something else from here, right? I mean, yes, they have a nice young core. Their primary 4 guys have upside, and that's great. But they need that little extra bit. They need to round out their lineup. They need to figure out what they're going to do with their bench. And full disclosure, they actually have Larry Nance Jr. on their team as well, who's been doing just a phenomenal job as a defender, rebounder, passer, playmaker, and opportunistic scorer. But you also have to wonder, given that he's 28, if he is the right fit moving forward. So for the Cavs, it looks like they have to play the draft game once again. And yes, right now they are not projected to pick number 1. You don't know what can happen. The draft lottery is so far ahead that we don't even have a set date for it. Currently on Tankathon, they're projected as picking 6th. So if we apply that logic to the future and we just establish they're picking 6th, then it becomes a very interesting situation where they might have a chance to pick up Jonathan Kuminga. Personally, I think he goes in the top 5, but who knows? There's still a lot of time left. Things can change. If Kuminga is available, I think he's a guy they need to give a look. First and foremost, Kuminga is a guy who can be slotted in at both the 3 and the 4, a little bit similar to Isaac Okoro, honestly. He's got great length, athleticism, he's got some playmaking chops and defensive upside. If you pair those 2 guys at the forward slots, you get a very modern looking NBA roster because you're getting guys who are interchangeable, who aren't necessarily stuck in the big position, and you're playing 4 out and 1 in with Jared Allen being the primary big guy on the court at all times. That allows you a lot of quickness, a lot of speed, and it should give the Cavs, long term at least, enough of a kick in the butt to become one of those teams that you would just hate to go up against because you have to cover the entire court at all times because they're quick, agile, athletic, and hungry. Don't underestimate the hunger for a young team. It's there, trust me. So right now, for the Cavs, what do they need to do in the meantime? Well, first and foremost, we have the March 25th NBA trade deadline coming up. And that could be a pretty important day for the Cavs. Understandably so, they can't really move off of Drummond, But if they were willing to move off of Larry Nance Jr., I'm fairly certain they could get a pretty decent haul. Maybe we're talking about a future first-round draft pick. Maybe we're talking about a young guy. Maybe you're willing to take on a young guy and a protected first-rounder down the line. There are definitely variations you could look at. Or maybe, hell, you want to keep Larry Nance Jr. around because he's a good, solid NBA player, and you think he's young enough to build around along with the youngsters that I just brought up earlier. Either way, you're in a pretty good spot in that regard, but if you want to have more bites at the apple just in terms of the draft, he would be one of the major trade components you could use to facilitate that. Now, of course, I know most Cavs fans would love to be able to trade Kevin Love because he really doesn't fit the team from an age perspective. Unfortunately, he's just owed so much money that he right now just does not look like a guy you can move off at all unless you actually had to give up assets, and that would be a tremendously bad idea. There are moments when you can afford to give up assets to get off of a big contract, but that's never the case for rebuilding teams who are trying to accumulate assets. That's just not a good plan. You just have to ride it out and wait for his contract to expire. Maybe you can move him as an expiring contract at some point where the Cavs would be willing to take on long-term money for someone who's maybe a little bit better but still overpaid. That could be an option down the line. Ultimately, though, they still come into the summer with cap flexibility, and this is crucial because that's a team that could come into the free agency market and look at young guys, maybe even play the restricted free agency market and trying to muck up things a little bit for other teams. Remember when the Brooklyn Nets decided to just annoy the ever-living hell out of virtually everyone by maxing guys in restricted free agency, forcing other teams to match? The Cleveland Cavaliers, man. They could be one of those teams just to do that. Maybe they throw a max offer sheet at John Collins. Maybe they throw a huge offer sheet the way of Lonzo Ball. There are a lot of different things they could do here because they're young, they have money, they have a certain baseline of production. This could be a team that over the next year or two could be very, very interesting and exciting to watch, both on the court, but also how they conduct themselves off the court in terms of like trade strategies or free agent strategy, and how they basically are planning to accumulate and gather this roster of young players and trying to build around them in the right way. Also worth noting is the fact that given that they have money to spend, there are young guys on the market that you can always try to get into the fold. There are routinely every single year at least a handful of players who may not have lived up to certain expectations and are thus getting a little bit underrated, so they're let go. And Moritz Wagner from the Washington Wizards, for example, they decided not to pick up his fourth-year option. Personally, I think that's a huge mistake. He could be a young guy they could be looking at and signing. That would be a pretty decent pickup, especially from an offensive perspective. He can come in, stretch the floor. He's efficient from the field. That is one of those small gambles where you look at it and go, oh, that's actually pretty smart because he can grow with the roster. He's not a finished product, and the money you're paying him, presumably not a lot, could make that a pretty decent value contract. Again, it depends on the monetary terms, but given that the Washington Wizards decided not even to give him the fourth year on his rookie contract, I have to assume you can get him for somewhat cheaply. In a previous episode, I spoke about the Sam Hinkie special. No need to reiterate it, you can watch that right here. But the point of that being, there are guys, young guys out on the market, maybe potential guys who go undrafted in the 2021 NBA draft, who the Cavaliers can pick up and sign outright to just insanely cheap deals. Long-term deals, no less. And if one of them hits, or maybe even two hits, that's huge. That's a big, big boon for a young, developing, rebuilding team in trying to accumulate assets. For the Cavaliers overall, it's just crucial that they don't panic. Now, when they traded for Andre Drummond, they were actually pretty smart about it because they gave up virtually nothing. They gave up Brendan Knight, John Henson, and a second rounder. Again, that's nothing. So they knew that they were getting a guy in who was highly productive, and if it didn't work out, which it didn't, they could just let him expire or maybe explore a trade. Now they're doing that. Maybe it ends up being a buyout. Whatever, it didn't really cost them anything. That was a smart play. And as long as they use that same brightness and cleverness, there's a good chance they could unearth some pretty decent players on the NBA market, be that through trade, signings, or maybe even accumulating a lot of second-round draft picks in some way and get guys in who are cheap, who they retain the rights to, and you can figure out what you have a couple years down the line. Maybe even find a couple guys you could stash overseas. There are so many options, and given that they have financial flexibility, given that they already have a young core, given that they have their first-round draft pick, look, the sky is the limit for the Cleveland Cavaliers. They just have to plan it out right, and they have to stay true to the execution of it. By not panicking, we're seeing what the New York Knicks are doing. Finally, after years of panicking, they finally decided to take a step back and say, you know what, we're in no rush. We're rebuilding. We're trying to do it the right way. The Cavaliers, for the first time in a long while, are doing the same thing. They're taking a step back. They're breathing in and they're going, let's see what we have here. There's no reason to make panic trades, panic signings. There's no reason to cash in our chips on some guy we may not believe in. We're looking at the long run. We're in it for the long haul. That's why we got Jared Allen in the trade. We have a young nucleus of players that we intend to grow. So over the next couple of years, I wouldn't be shocked whatsoever to see that nucleus of young players grow. And I wouldn't be shocked either if they made it a priority to target veterans who come in with a reputation of being high locker room characters. Because you just need that. We're seeing the effects that has in Chicago with Thaddeus Young and Garrett Temple. You can find those guys out there. A guy like Ed Davis is renowned for the way that he conducts himself as a professional in the locker room, the way he speaks to teammates, the way that he takes young teammates under his wing. Those guys are out there. The strategy is pretty clear, but it makes it so much easier when you already have guys who are productive and you know you can rely upon them. Because then you're not entering a season full of question marks. You know you have Colin Sexton. You know you have Darius Garland. You know you have Jared Allen. And you know that Isaac Okoro is presumably going to develop into one of the better perimeter defenders in the NBA. That's not nothing. And sure, maybe some things won't go as planned. That happens. In every rebuilding process, you will occasionally sidestep to a point where you make a mistake. It happens. But as long as you get several bites at the apple in terms of draft, in terms of free agency, you don't spend your money on one guy who you may not be sure about, it's okay. You can afford having a mistake here and there as long as you stay true to your primary mission. The Cavaliers, as of right now, are doing just that. And I think it's time that we give them just a little bit more attention, a little more trust, and a little bit more optimism their way. Because we haven't for years. After LeBron left for the first time, we more or less ignored them. When he left the second time, same story. They are finally building out an identity off their own merits. They are not riding LeBron James' coattails. They're doing something in their own right, and that's damn respectable. I am personally super excited to see what they end up doing, not just this summer, but the next summer and summer after that, because they have every component to be good again. It's just a matter of time and execution.